The moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns as Terrence slipped out of the villa, drawn by Blake's hushed summons. The evening had been unusually pleasant, filled with laughter and shared stories. But Terrence had sensed a subtle tension lurking beneath the surface. Blake, typically boisterous and energetic, had been uncharacteristically quiet, avoiding his sister and mother, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He found Blake perched on the edge of the stone fountain, his small frame silhouetted against the shimmering water. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth, a familiar aroma that usually brought Terrence comfort. But tonight it felt heavy, suffocating. "Dad," Blake began, his voice a curious blend of Italian cadence and a smattering of English words. "I don't know what's going on, but something is wrong. Very wrong." Terrence knelt beside his son, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is it, Blake? What's wrong?" Blake hesitated, his eyes darting around, as if he feared being overheard. "The olio di oliva. It is the root of it all, Dad. I don't know why, but it's the olive oil. It changes people." Terrence frowned, his mind struggling to make sense of Blake's cryptic words. "What do you mean it changes people? How?" Blake shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I can't explain it, Dad. I feel it. It makes them different. Like they're not themselves anymore." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant hills, his voice tender. "And I don't like Signor Rossi, Dad. There's something dark about him." The hairs on the nape of Terrence's neck stood on end. He had dismissed Blake's earlier concerns as childish fears, but now, listening to his son's earnest words, he couldn't help but feel a prickle of unease. "He reminds me of, what is it called in English? An Emperor Roman, Papa." un imperatore romano. He makes me afraid. Terrence stared at his son, his mind reeling. Blake, a child of 9, speaking with the wisdom and gravitas of an ancient Roman, expressing a fear that Terrence himself had been struggling to articulate. Afraid? Why? Terrence asked softly. Blake shivered, his small body trembling in the cold night air. He has so much power, Papa. He controls everything. And he looks at Mama the way a Roman emperor looks at a conquered land that he wants to take. Terrence's blood ran cold. He thought back to Signor Rossi's lingering gazes, his possessive touches, York's increasingly provocative behavior. Was it possible that his mentor, his benefactor, was actually a predator, a manipulator, who was slowly taking control of their lives? Thank you, Blake, Terrence said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for telling me this. I promise I'll figure out what's going on. He pulled Blake into a tight embrace, his heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. He knew that he couldn't dismiss his son's warnings any longer. Something was happening in Riva Presso Chieri. Something sinister. And he had to uncover the truth before it was too late. Blake smiled, a sad smile, and whispered in a thick Italian accent, "Promettimi, Papa. Promise me, Papa. Promise me you will protect us." The weight of Blake's words pressed heavily on Terrence as he made his way to Signor Rossi's estate the next morning. He intended to confront the old man, to demand answers. But as he approached the grand villa, a wave of apprehension washed over him. Signor Rossi was a powerful figure, a man who commanded respect and wielded influence. Terrence knew that he had to tread carefully, that a misstep could have devastating consequences. He found Signor Rossi overseeing a group of villagers, including York and the children, who were diligently digging holes in the fertile soil. It appeared they were practicing for the upcoming olive planting season. But there was a strange intensity to their efforts, a sense of forced enthusiasm that made Terrence uneasy. Antonio, Terrence began, his voice hesitant. I need to talk to you. Signor Rossi turned to him, his eyes inscrutable. Of course, Terrence. What is it? He said this in front of everybody, causing Terrence to feel unable to voice what he was feeling. Terrence, intimidated by the old man's presence and the watchful eyes of the villagers, faltered. He couldn't bring himself to voice his suspicions, to accuse Signor Rossi of anything. I wanted to thank you for all your help with the tomatoes, he stammered, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and to ask if there's anything I can do to prepare for the olive planting. Signor Rossi smiled, his eyes glinting with amusement. You're a good man, Terrence, he said, patting him on the back. Always eager to learn, always willing to work hard. You'll go far in this world. As Terrence watched York, Blake, and Sarah continue their digging, their faces blank and expressionless, he felt a pang of despair. He had failed them. He had let fear and intimidation silence him, allowing Signor Rossi to maintain his grip on their lives. The drive home was a silent affair. York, Blake, and Sarah were exhausted, their faces pale and drawn. Terrence tried to engage them in conversation, but they were unresponsive. Their eyes glazed over with fatigue and a strange sort of resignation. As they settled into bed that night, Terrence felt utterly defeated. He had promised Blake that he would protect them, but he had failed to live up to his word. He drifted off to sleep, haunted by images of Signor Rossi's knowing smile and the villagers' vacant stares. The next morning, Terrence awoke to an unexpected surprise. Durham, York's sister, was standing in the living room, her face etched with concern behind the wide smile. Durham, what are you doing here? Terrence exclaimed. I was worried about you both, she said, her eyes searching his face. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. York, who had been conspicuously absent, entered the room, her expression a carefully constructed mask of civility. Durham, what a surprise. I would have picked you up. I'm sorry to bother you, York, Durham replied as naturally as possible. Bother? Don't be silly, Darry. She chuckled behind her hand. You're my older sister. You're more than welcome. The children rushed to greet their aunt, their faces lighting up with genuine joy. Blake, however, cast a worried glance at Terrence, his eyes conveying a silent message of caution. Under York's direction, Durham was settled into the main room, where she spent the night, whilst York and Terrence took the Venetian sofa bed, as there were no more spare rooms available at the moment. As the still of darkness consumed the house, Terrence found himself alone with Durham on the Venetian sofa bed. What are you doing? Terrence inquired. Just watching the olive trees across the valley. They move funny, Durham replied, squinting her eyes. Are you cold? Slightly. Terrence pulled out a blanket from the mahogany kist. Wait, where's York? I heard her come into your room. She grabbed a coat from the wardrobe. He handed her the blanket and settled into the sleeper, awaiting more information. She walked past you and left through the kitchen door very quietly. Durham suspected York was cheating and knew something was wrong, but had no idea of the depth of what was occurring. As they lay side by side in the darkness, their bodies separated by a thin blanket, Durham spoke softly. You seem different, Terrence, she said, her hand resting on his back. You don't seem to care about things you used to base your entire life around. Terrence remained silent. You're right, Terrence said, realizing what she had done. She quickly withdrew her hand and apologized. Don't apologize. I did not mind. Terrence quickly added. That's concerning to hear, Durham responded. Before they were able to continue, she drifted off to sleep with Terrence, both tired and restless. In the early hours of the morning, Durham awoke to a strange sensation. Someone was lying beside her, their body pressed against hers. She turned her head and saw York, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. York softly removed her hand and replaced it with Terrence's. Before Durham could react, York gently nudged Terrence closer to Durham. Her lips brushing against her ear. Terrence has had a hard time. You should make him happy, York whispered lustfully. That's sick, Durham clapped back. She felt the very blood in her veins begin to curdle, and the air reek of her sister's depravity. Instinctively, she draped her leg over Terrence, pulling his lifeless body closer to hers, her heart rattling against the confines of her bosom. Durham had never held a man so intensely before. Her arm, a physical barrier between his back and his wife's body. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the aftermath of a night filled with unspoken tension and unsettling revelations. Terrence awoke with a start, his head throbbing, his body stiff and sore. He glanced at Durham, who was already awake, her eyes filled with disbelief. They rose and made their way to the breakfast table, where York and the children were already waiting. The atmosphere was strained, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery and the rustling of newspapers. Durham initiated a conversation with Terrence. So, Terrence, she began, her voice carefully neutral. How did you come to acquire this property? It's quite a place. Terrence, still groggy and disoriented, launched into a brief explanation, mentioning the inheritance from his estranged parents. They weren't really involved in my life, he confessed, almost without thinking. And to be honest, nobody in my life has lived here for Well, for at least 137 years, as far as I know. Durham's eyes widened imperceptibly. 137 years. That was a significant detail. A piece of the puzzle that seemed to fit into place with a disturbing click. She reached out her hand, intending to offer Terrence a gesture of comfort, but quickly retracted it, realizing that the children were watching them with rapt attention. A wave of determination washed over Durham. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to assess the situation, to get a read on Signor Rossi, to understand the hold he had on York and Terrence. She turned to York, her voice sharp and assertive. "York," she said, her eyes unwavering. "I want to meet Antonio. Now." York met Durham's demand with an unsettling calm, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Of course, darling," she said, her voice dripping with honeyed sarcasm. "I'm sure Antonio would be delighted to meet you. We can go right now. Terrence?" Terrence remained silent, his gaze fixed on his plate, his mind racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He wanted to warn Durham, to tell her what Blake had said, but he couldn't bring himself to speak in front of York. As they prepared to leave, Terrence found a moment to brush his hand against Durham's. Her skin was soft and warm, a comforting reminder of the life he had left behind. She didn't turn to face him, but her fingers gently squeezed his in return, a silent promise of support and understanding. Before they left, York addressed the children, her voice laced with authority. "Blake and Sarah," she said, "we're off to meet Signor Rossi. Please continue with your duties at his villa, though." She then left with Durham, Terrence following a few strides behind. As they walked away, Durham glanced back and saw Blake and Sarah heading towards the distant olive grove, their small figures carrying shovels with an unnatural determination. As they continued walking, Durham started to believe everything was staged. As they walked on the streets, Durham couldn't help but notice her own reflection in the windows of the village shops. She had always been attractive, but today there was a newfound confidence in her stride, a spark of determination in her eyes that made her even more alluring. Terrence, despite his best efforts, couldn't help but steal glances at her, his heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and longing. He tried to justify his feelings, telling himself that it was simply a reaction to York's infidelity, a desperate attempt to find solace in the familiar comfort of his sister-in-law. Terrence's gaze lingered on Durham, his mind struggling to reconcile the sister he knew with the captivating woman who stood before him. He noticed the subtle curve of her olive-toned skin, the way the sunlight caught in her dark, curly hair, the effortless grace of her movements. She possessed a natural beauty, a timeless allure that reminded him of a classical Aphrodite, a goddess sprung from the earth. He forced his thoughts back to the present, desperate to escape the treacherous path his mind was taking. He excused himself and requested to join the children at the olive grove, seeking solace in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. He found Blake and Sarah diligently digging, their small bodies glistening with sweat, their faces etched with determination. He felt a surge of guilt, realizing that he had been neglecting them, allowing Signor Rossi to manipulate them into his endless task. "Let me help," he said, taking a shovel from Sarah. The children didn't respond, but their eyes lit up with a flicker of relief. As Terrence joined them, he noticed that the holes were far deeper than he had initially realized. They were nearly half his height, their dark depths swallowing the sunlight. As they dug, a group of villagers approached, their faces beaming with encouragement. "Keep up the good work," they exclaimed. "You're doing a great job." Their support, though well-intentioned, felt unsettling, a further reinforcement of the strange sense of obligation that permeated the village. Terrence dug harder, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion. He needed to prove to himself, to his children, that he was still capable of taking control, of protecting them from whatever darkness lurked in Riva Presocchieri. As the sun began to set, York and Durham arrived, their faces flushed with excitement. They both looked dazed and light-headed. "Antonio is simply divine," York gushed, her eyes sparkling. "You'll adore what he has told us he wants to do with our children, to help mold them into their full potential." Durham, however, her smile strained, her eyes darting nervously. She took Terrence's arm, her voice a gentle tremor. "We have to go," she said, her grip tightening on his arm. "You need to take the kids and leave. I can only stay one more night." A wave of disbelief washed over Terrence as Durham's words sank in. The holes, the children, the olive trees. It was all connected. A horrifying ritual that defied logic and reason. "But the money," Terrence stammered, his voice trembling. "I made so much money, and Signor Rossi promised." Durham cut him off, her eyes blazing with fury. "Don't you see, Terrence? It was never about the money. It was about them. About using your children to perpetuate their twisted traditions." Just then, Blake approached, his face pale and drawn. "Papa, he began, his voice thin from exhaustion. Terrence, overwhelmed by fear and confusion, brushed him aside. "Not now, Blake," he said, his voice curt. "I need to think." Durham grabbed his hand, her grip firm and urgent. "Listen to me, Terrence. The children are the key to the olive trees. They believe they will bring them eternal youth and prosperity." She nervously tried to make eye contact with Terrence. Sarah stepped forward. It was clear that she had overheard their conversation. Before they could continue, Sarah, her eyes dark and piercing, pulled Durham by the arm. Sarah started speaking calmly, with instructive intent, correcting that it was wrong for her to reveal their secret, and that it was to be a surprise for Daddy. York stepped forward, her face a mask of serenity. "It's time," she said, her voice gentle yet commanding. The ceremony must begin. The entire village now stood around them, their faces expressionless, their eyes void of emotion. It was a macabre procession, a chilling testament to the power of tradition and the depths of human depravity. The truth became horrifyingly clear. The halls were not for planting olive trees. They were graves, meticulously prepared for Blake and Sarah. Durham exploded with rage, unleashing a torrent of curses and accusations. But Terrence, strangely, remained calm, his mind numb with shock. He watched, paralyzed with fear, as the villagers gently placed Blake and Sarah standing into the deep holes, their small bodies swallowed by the earth. They began to chant, their voices rising in a hypnotic crescendo. York joined in, her eyes shining with a feverish intensity. As they chanted, they began to fill the holes with soil, slowly burying Blake and Sarah alive. Terrence jolted back to reality, finally snapped. He lunged forward, screaming and clawing at the villagers, desperate to save his children. But they held him back, their strength fueled by centuries of tradition and unwavering belief. Blake, sensing his father's distress, fought back with a ferocity that belied his age. He kicked and screamed, managing to claw his way out of the hole. "Papa," he cried, his voice hoarse with terror. Durham, seeing her opportunity, seized Terrence's hand, her voice ringing with urgency. "We have to go, Terrence, now. If you want to save what's left of your family, you have to trust me." They ran, their feet pounding against the earth, leaving behind York and the chanting villagers. As they fled, Terrence caught a glimpse of Sarah. Only her small wrist left protruding from the soil. As they burst out of the olive grove, the battered car screeched to a halt beside them. It was the stranger who had been watching them, his face etched with concern. "Get in," he shouted, his voice urgent. They scrambled into the car, catching their breath as they sped away from the villa. Terrence looked back and saw York standing hand in hand with Signor Rossi, their faces illuminated by the setting sun, their eyes filled with a chilling triumph. The doors rattling from the dusty road, their minds racing away from reality. Durham held his thigh with a firmness of security he had never felt before. Blake, poor Blake, drooped his head into the darkness of reality, telling the driver and all in Italian within earshot, "We have to burn it all."